The coffin descended into Detroit's frozen ground at Woodmere Cemetery on February 14, 1927. While the supposed corpse inside watched from behind a mausoleum 50 yards away, counting the mourners who never came. Steam rose from the gravedigger's shovels as they worked in silence, burying an empty casket that cost more than most families earned in 6 months. This is the story of a man who discovered that being legally dead was worth more than being alive, until the price of his deception became higher than anyone living or dead should ever pay. Detroit, in 1927, hummed with the sound of assembly lines, the smell of motor oil, mixing with winter coal smoke, and the rough texture of a city building itself, into the future one automobile at a time. The Ford River Rouge complex employed over 100,000 men, their paychecks fueling speakeasies, dance halls, and the kind of desperate optimism that made people believe they could outrun their past by simply moving fast enough. But not everyone thrived in the Motor City's relentless pace. Some men discovered that industrial progress created new ways to disappear, and Victor Matthias had found the most permanent escape of all death itself. Michigan Death Certificate, 4,471. February 12, 1927, deceased. Victor Eugene Matthias, age 34. Cause: industrial accident, crushed by falling machinery. Witness: Samuel Kowalski. Plant foreman. The death certificate was genuine, filed with Wayne County and signed by Dr. 199 Herbert Kellman, a physician whose medical practice served the immigrant neighborhoods where questions weren't asked as long as bills were paid. The funeral director, Morris Stein, had handled the arrangements with professional discretion, never mentioning that the casket he'd ordered contained only bags of sand and scrap metal to approximate body weight. Victor Matthias had paid handsomely for his own death, but the man who emerged from behind that mausoleum was someone entirely different, at least on paper. The transformation had taken months of planning. Victor's wife Helen had received a life insurance payout of $10,000, equivalent to 15 years of factory wages. She'd wept convincingly at the funeral service, though her tears were real, not from grief, but from terror about the plan her husband had forced her to execute. Death was profitable business. What Helen Matthias didn't know, as she stood beside that empty grave, was that her husband's death certificate was just the first document in a file that would eventually contain 17 different identities, 12 bank accounts, and evidence of crimes that spanned from Detroit to Chicago to New York City. The insurance investigator, Frank Morrison, had signed off on the claim after a cursory examination of the plant accident report. Industrial deaths were common enough in Detroit's factories that one more crushed worker barely merited attention. Besides, Victor Matthias had been a model employee, punctual, reliable, unremarkable in every way that mattered to men who dealt in statistics rather than souls. But Morrison had missed something crucial in his investigation. The plant foreman who'd witnessed Victor's supposed death, Samuel Kowalski, had been transferred to a different shift just 3 days before the accident. The machinery that allegedly crushed Victor had been scheduled for maintenance that morning, meaning it shouldn't have been operational when the fatal incident occurred. Case file M1000, 847, M Michigan Mutual Life Insurance. February 28, 1927. Claim processed and paid. Deceased, verified by plant supervisor and attending physician. No irregularities noted. As Helen Matthias walked away from her husband's fake funeral, she carried $10,000 in insurance money and a secret that would consume the next 2 years of her life. Behind her, the man she'd married watched from the shadows, no longer Victor Matthias, but someone else entirely, someone with plans that extended far beyond faking his own death. The snow began falling harder, covering the fresh grave with a pristine white blanket that would melt by spring, revealing nothing but empty earth beneath. But by then, the man who'd paid to stay dead would have discovered that death was only the beginning of his true work. and Detroit's industrial prosperity had created opportunities that existed nowhere else in America. What would you do if you discovered that your own death was worth more than your life? If you learned that the legal system's bureaucratic inefficiencies could be exploited by anyone clever enough to navigate the gaps between official records and actual truth? But as Victor Matthias began his new existence in the shadows of Detroit's industrial landscape, he was about to learn that staying dead required more than paperwork. It demanded a willingness to ensure that anyone who threatened to expose his secret would join him in the grave, permanently this time. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this story has already gotten under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we uncover next will make Victor's fake funeral seem like child's play compared to the very real bodies that started piling up when people began asking too many questions about the man who supposedly died but kept making withdrawals from accounts that should have been closed forever. Thomas Hartwell withdrew $300 from First National Bank of Detroit at 11:45 a.m. on March 7, 1927, using identification papers that bore no resemblance to the Victor Matthias who'd been buried 3 weeks earlier. The bank teller, Miss Dorothy Chen, processed the transaction without question, noting only that Mr. Hartwell's signature matched the account application filed just days after Victor's funeral. When the legally dead begin conducting business among the living, the line between fraud and survival becomes as thin as the paper that separates one identity from another. The transformation required more than new documents. It demanded a complete reconstruction of personality, habits, and history. Thomas Hartwell, dressed in tailored suits instead of Victor's factory coveralls. He spoke with a slight accent that suggested European education rather than Detroit's immigrant neighborhoods. Most importantly, he possessed financial resources that no assembly line worker could legitimately accumulate. Victor had spent the 6 months before his fake death methodically transferring funds from his legitimate savings into accounts opened under false names. Small amounts, withdrawn in cash and deposited elsewhere to avoid suspicion. By the time of his staged funeral, Thomas Hartwell's bank account contained over $8,000, money that officially belonged to a dead man but legally belonged to someone who'd never existed. The dead made excellent business partners. Detroit's rapid industrial expansion created perfect conditions for identity theft on an unprecedented scale. Immigrant workers arrived daily, many with limited English and few official documents. Factory accidents killed dozens each month, their deaths recorded in ledgers but rarely investigated thoroughly. Birth certificates could be obtained from rural Michigan counties, where record-keeping remained haphazard at best. Thomas Hartwell established himself in a boarding house on Grand River Avenue, paying cash for a room that Victor Matthias could never have afforded. He told fellow tenants that he'd recently arrived from Chicago, having sold a small manufacturing business at a substantial profit. The story explained his money while establishing a background that discouraged detailed questions. Police report D3471, March 15, 1927. Missing person report filed by Mrs. Helen Matthias. Husband supposedly deceased, but neighbors report seeing man matching his description near family residence. Helen Matthias had discovered the flaws in her husband's death scheme when she attempted to claim his factory pension benefits. The paperwork required signatures from witnesses who could verify Victor's employment history, but several key documents had been altered or destroyed. When she visited the plant to obtain missing records, Foreman Samuel Kowalski mentioned seeing someone who looked remarkably like her dead husband near the factory gates. The insurance investigator, Frank Morrison, reopened his examination of Victor's death claim after Helen's inquiry raised questions about the original accident report. His investigation revealed discrepancies in the timing of events. The machinery involved had indeed been shut down for maintenance when Victor supposedly died. The attending physician, Dr. Herbert Kellman, became evasive when questioned about his examination of the body, but Morrison's investigation stalled when he tried to locate physical evidence. The body had been cremated immediately after the funeral, supposedly at the family's request. No autopsy had been performed. The factory accident report existed only as a single copy, filed in Samuel Kowalski's handwriting, but lacking the required supervisor signatures. Death certificates proved easier to forge than verify. Thomas Hartwell learned about the investigation through contacts he'd cultivated in Detroit's administrative offices. A city clerk named Raymond Becker had developed a profitable sideline providing information about official inquiries, police investigations, and court proceedings. For the right price, Becker could warn clients about unwanted attention from authorities. The news that Frank Morrison was investigating Victor Matthias's death forced Thomas into action. He couldn't simply disappear again. Too many people had seen him conducting business around Detroit. Instead, he needed to eliminate the source of suspicion permanently. Bank transaction record. First National, March 18, 1927. T. Hartwell. Withdrawal. 500 cash. Account balance. 7,847. Thomas used the cash to hire 2 men from Detroit's underground economy enforcers who'd learned their trade during Prohibition's early years, when competition between bootleggers required permanent solutions to temporary problems. Their names were never recorded in any official document, but witnesses later described them as professionals who asked no questions as long as payment arrived on schedule. What happened to Frank Morrison on the night of March 22nd would be officially recorded as a robbery gone wrong. His body was found in an alley behind his office. Wallet missing. Investigation notes scattered by wind and rain. The case file on Victor Matthias's death disappeared from police headquarters the same night, though no break-in was reported. How far would you go to protect a lie that had become more profitable than truth? How many people would you sacrifice to maintain an identity built on the foundation of your own fake death? But as Thomas Hartwell celebrated the elimination of the most immediate threat to his new existence, he discovered that staying dead in Detroit required more than eliminating investigators. It meant becoming something far more dangerous than the factory worker who'd climbed into that empty coffin, and the real body count was only just beginning. Dr. Herbert Kellman's medical practice occupied the basement of a 3-story tenement on Michigan Avenue, where the smell of carbolic acid mixed with boiled cabbage from the apartments above, and patients paid their bills in cash or factory scrip rather than checks that could be traced by authorities. The frosted windows allowed just enough light to examine wounds without revealing faces, and the back entrance opened onto an alley where discretion mattered more than medical credentials. When legitimate medicine fails to serve illegal purposes, underground doctors become essential partners in crimes that require official documentation to succeed. Kellman had arrived in Detroit from Chicago in 1924, carrying medical credentials that appeared genuine but had never been verified by Michigan's licensing board. His practice thrived in neighborhoods where recent immigrants trusted anyone who spoke their language and asked no questions about how injuries occurred or why patients needed death certificates for people who remained suspiciously healthy. Thomas Hartwell visited Dr. Kellman's basement office on March 28th, exactly 6 days after Frank Morrison's body was discovered in that alley. He carried a briefcase containing $1,500 in cash and documents that would require the doctor's professional signature to become legally binding. The dead needed medical attention too. "I require another death certificate," Thomas explained, placing photographs and personal documents on Kellman's examination table. This time for Thomas Hartwell. Industrial accident. Similar circumstances to the previous arrangement. Dr. Kellman examined the materials with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to evaluate forgeries rather than symptoms. The death would need to be believable, documented with enough detail to satisfy insurance investigators, but not so elaborate as to invite detailed scrutiny. Medical report, ex. Kellman. March 1927. Patient presented with severe crushing injuries consistent with factory machinery accident. Death occurred at 3:15 p.m. despite resuscitation attempts. Body released to family for immediate burial. The second death certificate allowed Thomas Hartwell to collect another life insurance payout while simultaneously creating space for a new identity. Within 48 hours, James Morrison, no relation to the deceased investigator, opened accounts at 3 different Detroit banks using identification papers that traced back to a birth certificate issued in rural Hillsdale County. But Dr. Kelman's basement practice served more than just Thomas's identity schemes. The medical office functioned as headquarters for an underground network that provided false documents, staged accidents, and permanent solutions to problems that couldn't be resolved through legal channels. Police grew suspicious of patterns. Detective Lieutenant William Hayes of Detroit Metropolitan Police had noticed an unusual cluster of industrial accidents involving men whose families immediately requested cremation and whose insurance claims were processed with remarkable speed. 7 deaths in 6 months, all involving similar machinery, all witnessed by the same small group of plant foremen. Hayes began his investigation by examining death certificates filed by Dr. Herbert Kelman. The physician had signed off on 34 industrial deaths since arriving in Detroit, a rate that exceeded the city average by nearly 300%. When Hayes attempted to interview Dr. Kelman, he discovered that the basement office had been abandoned overnight with no forwarding address left for patients or authorities. The detective's inquiry uncovered a sophisticated operation that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud. Bank records showed that several of the supposedly deceased men had continued making transactions weeks or months after their official deaths. Property transfers had been executed using forged signatures. Most disturbing, 3 people who'd asked questions about the deaths had subsequently disappeared without explanation. Underground networks required permanent silence. James Morrison learned about Detective Hayes' investigation through the same information network that had warned him about Frank Morrison's inquiry. But this time, eliminating the threat wouldn't be as simple as hiring street enforcers to stage a robbery. Hayes was a decorated police officer with political connections and a reputation for persistent investigation. Instead, James decided to eliminate the detective's credibility by framing him for corruption. Using contacts in Detroit's criminal underworld, he arranged for marked bills from a recent bank robbery to be planted in Hayes' patrol car. Anonymous tips would lead internal affairs investigators to discover the evidence during a routine inspection. Detroit Police Internal Affairs Report, April 15, 1927. Detective Lieutenant William Hayes suspended pending investigation of suspected corruption. Evidence of stolen currency discovered during vehicle inspection. The frame job worked perfectly. Hayes found himself under investigation. Instead of conducting one, his inquiry into the mysterious deaths officially suspended while Internal Affairs examined his conduct. Without his driving force, the police investigation stalled, and James Morrison remained safely dead while his new identity established deeper roots in Detroit's financial community. But Hayes refused to accept his suspension quietly. From his home on Corktown's narrow streets, he continued investigating the deaths privately, using connections built over 15 years of police work to gather information that official channels had denied him. What would you do if you discovered that the system designed to protect society was being systematically corrupted by criminals sophisticated enough to turn law enforcement against itself? How many coincidental deaths would it take before you risked your own career to expose the truth? Detective Hayes was about to discover that some investigations exact a price higher than professional ruin, and James Morrison's network had developed methods for dealing with persistent threats that left no evidence and no witnesses to contradict their carefully constructed version of events. Detective William Hayes sat in his kitchen at 2:37 a.m. on April 23, 1927, surrounded by newspaper clippings, insurance records, and photographs of men whose deaths had been too convenient and too profitable to be coincidental. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but the evidence spread across his table burned hotter than any stimulant. 7 dead men, 14 active bank accounts, and a pattern that pointed toward the most sophisticated fraud scheme Detroit had ever seen. When honest investigators refuse to abandon inconvenient truths, they become inconvenient truths themselves. And inconvenient truths rarely survive contact with people who profit from lies. Hayes had spent his suspension constructively, using personal connections to gather information that official channels had denied him. His brother-in-law worked at Michigan Mutual Life Insurance, providing access to claim records that revealed disturbing patterns. His former partner now ran security for First National Bank, sharing transaction data that showed dead men conducting very lively business. The evidence was overwhelming, but legally useless. Everything Hayes had gathered violated procedure, making it inadmissible in court, even if he could convince his superiors to reopen the investigation. But the truth he'd uncovered demanded action, even if that action destroyed what remained of his career. Corruption had infected every level. The frame job that suspended Hayes had been expertly executed, but it contained one fatal flaw. The marked bills planted in his patrol car bore serial numbers from a bank robbery that occurred 3 days after they were supposedly discovered in his possession. Hayes had meticulously documented the evidence-planting timeline, creating a record that would eventually exonerate him while exposing the people behind his suspension. But clearing his name wouldn't help the investigation if he was dead, and Hayes had begun receiving warnings that suggested his continued inquiry was attracting dangerous attention. His telephone rang at odd hours, with no one speaking when he answered. Strange men loitered near his house, watching but never approaching. His mail arrived, opened, and resealed with obvious carelessness. Personal Journal, Detective W. Hayes, April 25, 1927. They want me to know I'm being watched. Professional intimidation, designed to make me abandon the investigation. Instead, it confirms I'm getting close to something they can't afford to have exposed. James Morrison learned about Hayes's private investigation through Raymond Becker, the city clerk who'd been feeding him information about official inquiries. Becker had developed his own network of contacts throughout Detroit's bureaucracy, creating an early warning system that could track investigations before they became threats. The news that Hayes had obtained insurance records and bank transaction data forced James to consider more extreme measures than simple frame jobs or intimidation. The detective had gathered enough evidence to connect the fake deaths, trace the money flow, and potentially expose the entire network of forged documents and staged accidents. Dead witnesses couldn't testify. James arranged a meeting with Hayes through an anonymous telephone call, claiming to have information about the industrial death investigation that could clear the detective's name and expose the real criminals. The meeting was scheduled for 11 p.m. on April 28th in Riverside Park near the Detroit River, where darkness would provide privacy for sensitive revelations. Hayes recognized the setup, but attended anyway, carrying a concealed revolver and leaving detailed notes about the meeting location with his brother-in-law. He understood that refusing to meet would only delay the inevitable confrontation, while attending might provide an opportunity to gather evidence or identify the people behind the fraud scheme. The park at night was a different world from its daytime incarnation. Fog rolled off the Detroit River, muffling sounds and creating shadows that moved independently of their sources. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to numb exposed skin, but not cold enough to deter the desperate or the determined. Death waited in familiar places. James Morrison arrived at the meeting, carrying a briefcase filled with documents that appeared to support his claims about having inside information. But the real contents were items that would be found with Hayes's body. Planted evidence suggesting the detective had been killed during a drug transaction gone wrong, complete with heroin packets and marked bills that would discredit any investigation into his death. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes, Hayes drew his weapon first, but James had brought professional assistance. The same men who'd eliminated Frank Morrison now waited in the fog, positioned to ensure that Detective Hayes would never leave Riverside Park alive. But Hayes had prepared for this possibility. Before leaving his house, he'd given his brother-in-law a sealed envelope containing copies of all his evidence, with instructions to deliver it to the Detroit News if he failed to return by midnight. The package included photographs, bank records, insurance claims, and a detailed explanation of the fraud scheme that connected James Morrison to Victor Matthias and Thomas Hartwell. What would you do if you knew that exposing the truth would probably cost your life, but staying silent would allow other innocent people to die? How many deaths would you accept to protect your own safety? Detective Hayes made his choice in Riverside Park that night, but his death would prove to be the catalyst that transformed a local fraud investigation into a federal case that would expose corruption reaching far beyond Detroit city limits. And James Morrison was about to discover that some murders create more problems than they solve. Special Agent Catherine Romano of the Bureau of Investigation stepped off the Pennsylvania Railroad at Detroit's Michigan Central Station on May 2, 1927, carrying a leather satchel containing Detective Hayes's evidence package and authorization from Washington to investigate what had initially appeared to be isolated insurance fraud, but now suggested organized criminal activity. Spanning multiple states, the morning air carried the metallic tang of industrial smoke mixed with the earthy smell of the Detroit River, and the station's marble floors echoed with footsteps of travelers who had no idea their city harbored one of the most sophisticated identity theft operations in American history. When local corruption reaches federal attention, small-time criminals discover that their carefully constructed schemes face scrutiny from investigators who can't be bought, intimidated, or eliminated as easily as local police. Romano had received Hayes's evidence package through channels that bypassed Detroit's compromised police department entirely. The detective's brother-in-law, Thomas Chen, had delivered the materials directly to the Detroit News, but editor Marcus Webb recognized that the story required federal investigation before publication. Webb's telephone call to Washington had reached Director J. Edgar Hoover's desk within hours. The Bureau's interest wasn't purely altruistic. Federal agents had been tracking similar identity theft schemes in Chicago, Cleveland, and Buffalo operations that suggested coordination between criminal networks across state lines. Hayes's evidence provided the first concrete proof that these schemes were connected, operated by the same individuals using identical methods to exploit gaps in administrative oversight. Bureau of Investigation Case File 27-1847, May 3-1927. Agent Romano, assigned to investigate suspected interstate fraud ring. Primary suspect believed operating under multiple identities in Detroit area. Local law enforcement cooperation limited due to corruption concerns. Romano's first priority was establishing secure communication with honest officials in Detroit's government. Hayes's evidence package had identified several administrators who'd been compromised, including city clerks, insurance adjusters, and police supervisors. But it had also revealed potential allies, people who'd questioned suspicious deaths or unusual document requests without realizing they were observing coordinated criminal activity. Dr. Margaret Sinclair at Detroit General Hospital had noticed an unusual pattern in death certificates signed by Dr. Herbert Kellman. Her medical training made her suspicious of the similar injuries reported in supposedly unrelated industrial accidents. When Romano interviewed Dr. Day, Sinclair, she provided additional evidence that Hayes hadn't discovered medical supply orders that suggested Dr. Kellman had been treating live patients for injuries that matched their supposed death certificates. The dead required ongoing medical care. James Morrison learned about federal involvement through Raymond Becker, who'd been monitoring telegraph traffic and telephone calls for signs of outside investigation. The news that a bureau agent was examining Hayes' evidence forced James to consider abandoning Detroit entirely, but his network had become too profitable and too complex to simply walk away from. Instead, he decided to eliminate Agent Romano before she could connect him to the fraud scheme. Federal agents were harder targets than local investigators, but they weren't invincible. The same methods that had worked against Frank Morrison and William Hayes could be adapted to deal with Bureau of Investigation personnel. James arranged for Romano to receive anonymous information about a meeting where she could supposedly arrest the leader of the identity theft ring. The tip claimed that Victor Matthias, the original identity, was actually alive and planning to flee Detroit on May 8th. The meeting would take place at an abandoned warehouse on the Detroit River, where federal agents could make arrests without risking civilian casualties. Detroit News, ET, Internal Memo, May 6, 1927, Federal Agent Investigating Local Fraud Ring. Story held, pending investigation outcome. Editor Webb advises caution. Too many people connected to this case have died under suspicious circumstances. Romano recognized the setup, but prepared for it systematically. She arranged backup from Chicago Bureau office, positioned surveillance teams around the warehouse, and coordinated with honest Detroit police officers who'd been cleared through federal background checks. Unlike Hayes, she wouldn't face the threat alone. But James Morrison had learned from his previous eliminations. Instead of confronting Romano directly, he planned to destroy the warehouse with explosives, killing the federal agent while eliminating physical evidence of his operations. The explosion would appear to be an industrial accident. Old buildings near the river were known for gas leaks and structural failures. The warehouse at night was a monument to Detroit's industrial ambitions. 3 stories of brick and steel that had once housed automotive parts, but now served as storage for businesses that operated in legal gray areas. Broken windows stared out over the Detroit River like dead eyes, and the building's interior smelled of rust, rotting wood, and substances that had been stored there without regard for safety regulations. Federal agents faced professional killers. Romano entered the warehouse at exactly 9 p.m. on May 8th, followed by 3 backup agents positioned to cover all exits. They carried Thompson's submachine guns and federal arrest warrants, but James Morrison had no intention of allowing them to serve those warrants on anyone who might provide testimony about his operations. The explosion was timed to occur 15 minutes after Romano's arrival, giving James enough time to confirm that federal agents were inside before detonating charges placed throughout the building's support structure. But Romano had detected the setup early, discovering wiring and explosive devices during her initial reconnaissance. What would you do if you realized that exposing a criminal network required risking not just your own life, but the lives of other federal agents who trusted your judgment? How many people would you put in danger to bring one sophisticated criminal to justice? Agent Romano was about to discover that James Morrison's network extended far beyond Detroit, and the warehouse confrontation would reveal connections to organized crime families that made local police corruption seem insignificant compared to the nationwide conspiracy that had been using dead men's identities to commit crimes that the living couldn't imagine. Agent Romano cut the red wire at 9:14 p.m., disarming the final explosive charge wired to the warehouse's main support beam, while her backup team secured 3 men who'd been positioned to ensure no federal agents survived the planned detonation. The building's basement revealed equipment that transformed Romano's investigation from simple fraud into something far more sinister. A complete document forgery operation capable of producing birth certificates, death certificates, social security cards, and passports for clients across the Midwest. When criminal enterprises grow beyond local boundaries, they reveal connections that make individual cases into windows overlooking organized corruption that spans entire regions of the country. The basement workshop contained printing presses, paper supplies, official seals, and signature stamps from government agencies in 12 different states. Filing cabinets held customer records showing that James Morrison's operation had created over 200 false identities in the past 18 months, serving clients from Chicago crime families, Cleveland bootleggers, and New York racketeers who needed clean documentation for expanding their territories. Romano discovered that the identity theft scheme had evolved far beyond insurance fraud. The operation provided complete background fabrication for criminals seeking to infiltrate legitimate businesses, establish bank credit, and purchase property without revealing their actual criminal histories. Each false identity came with supporting documentation that could withstand routine background checks and government scrutiny. Criminal innovation matched industrial innovation. The captured men included Samuel Kowalski, the plant foreman who'd witnessed Victor Matthias's fake death, and Raymond Becker, the city clerk who'd been feeding information to James Morrison about official investigations. Under federal interrogation, both men revealed details about the network that shocked even experienced Bureau agents. James Morrison was actually Vincent Torino, a former Chicago bootlegger who'd faked his own death in 1925 to escape murder charges related to the Cicero beer wars. The Victor Matthias identity had been his first experiment in complete persona replacement, but its success had inspired him to establish a business serving other criminals who needed similar services. Federal interrogation transcript. May 10, 1927. Kowalski. He paid me $500 to sign that accident report. Said it was just insurance paperwork, nothing that would hurt anyone. I needed the money for my daughter's medical bills. Romano's investigation revealed that Dr. Herbert Kellman had been providing medical services to criminals whose official identities were deceased. The basement clinic wasn't just issuing false death certificates, it was treating gunshot wounds, stab injuries, and other trauma for men who couldn't seek legitimate medical care without revealing their true identities. The network's customer base included some of the most wanted criminals in America. Albert Karpus had purchased documentation that allowed him to operate in Detroit under the name Robert Harrison. Machine Gun Kelly had used Morrison's services to establish the identity that would later make him famous. Even members of the Purple Gang had utilized the operation to create backup identities for use when their primary personas became too hot for continued criminal activity. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that the network had been eliminating customers who became liabilities. Romano found records of 12 men who'd purchased false identities but were later killed when they threatened to expose the operation or demanded refunds for unsatisfactory documentation. The dead stayed dead permanently. James Morrison Vincent Torino had escaped during the warehouse raid, but Romano's team had recovered enough evidence to map his entire operation and identify his remaining associates. Bank records showed active accounts under 6 different names, all containing substantial funds that could finance his continued operation from a new location. The federal investigation had also revealed corruption that extended into Detroit's highest political offices. Mayor John Smith had received monthly payments from Morrison's operation in exchange for protection from official scrutiny. Police Commissioner William Rutherford had been providing advance warning of investigations and raids. Even federal Judge Harrison Matthews had been accepting bribes to dismiss cases involving Morrison's customers. Bureau of Investigation Priority. Cable May 12, 1927. Subject: Vincent Torino escaped Detroit. Believed headed toward Chicago. All field offices alert for arrest. Consider extremely dangerous, has killed multiple law enforcement officers. Romano coordinated with Chicago Bureau office to intercept Torino before he could re-establish his operation in a new city. But tracking a man whose expertise involved creating untraceable identities presented unique challenges. He could be traveling under any of dozens of documented personas, using credit established over months or years of careful preparation. The investigation had also revealed that Torino's network was part of a larger conspiracy involving organized crime families from multiple cities. The false identity operation served as infrastructure for criminal enterprises that required coordination across state lines, bootlegging, racketeering, murder for hire, and political corruption that treated law enforcement as just another business expense. What would you do if you discovered that the criminal you'd been hunting was connected to corruption that reached the highest levels of local government? How many powerful people would you be willing to destroy to capture one sophisticated fraudster? Agent Romano was about to learn that Vincent Torino's escape from Detroit was actually a strategic retreat to Chicago, where he planned to eliminate the federal agents pursuing him while reestablishing his operation on a scale that would make his Detroit network seem like a small-time rehearsal for the main performance. Vincent Torino stepped off the Michigan Central train at Chicago's Union Station on May 15, 1927, carrying a single leather valise and identification papers that identified him as Robert Sterling, a traveling salesman from Indianapolis with no criminal record and no connection to the federal manhunt spreading across the Midwest. The station's vast concourse echoed with announcements and footsteps, the air thick with coal smoke and the nervous energy of a city where everyone seemed to be running towards something or away from it. When sophisticated criminals choose battlegrounds on their own territory, federal agents discover that jurisdiction means nothing to people who've spent years learning how to make inconvenient problems disappear permanently. Chicago in 1927 was Vincent's natural habitat, a city where corruption had evolved into an art form and violence was just another business tool. His connections to the Capone organization dated back to his bootlegging days, when he'd provided false documentation for smuggling operations and territorial expansions. Those connections now offered sanctuary and resources for eliminating the federal agents who threatened his network. Agent Romano arrived in Chicago 6 hours behind Vincent, accompanied by 4 bureau agents and local police officers whose loyalty had been verified through federal background checks. But Chicago presented unique challenges. The city's political machine had been compromised by organized crime for decades, making it difficult to distinguish between honest officials and paid informants. Bureau coordination faced systematic obstruction. Romano's first meeting with Chicago police revealed the depth of corruption she faced. Captain Thomas Brennan claimed no knowledge of Vincent Torino, despite evidence showing that Torino had maintained safe houses in Chicago for over 2 years. Detective Michael Flynn suggested that Romano's investigation was based on fabricated evidence planted by Detroit criminals seeking to discredit honest businessmen. The federal agents found themselves isolated in a city where official cooperation came with strings attached and unofficial cooperation could be deadly. Romano arranged to work exclusively with bureau personnel, avoiding local law enforcement except when federal law required coordination. Chicago Tribune, IMC. Internal Memo, May 17, 1000. 927. Federal agents investigating identity theft ring. Local police claim no knowledge of suspects. Editor requests background check on detective sources. Too many conflicting stories about simple fraud case. Vincent had spent his first days in Chicago, reestablishing contact with his criminal network and arranging for Romano's elimination. The plan involved making her disappear during what would appear to be a routine investigation. Gone wrong federal agents killed by unknown criminals while pursuing leads that would never be found or verified. But Vincent's greatest advantage was his intimate knowledge of Chicago's underground economy. He could purchase weapons, hire killers, arrange safe transportation, and create diversions using resources that had been established over years of careful relationship building. Romano was investigating criminals on their home territory, where every advantage belonged to the people she was hunting. The confrontation began on May 19th, when Romano received an anonymous tip about Vincent's location in a warehouse district near Goose Island. The information appeared to come from an honest informant, but Romano had learned to distrust convenient intelligence that arrived without explanation or verification. Federal agents walked into prepared ambushes. Romano's team approached the warehouse with tactical support from Chicago Bureau office, but they discovered that Vincent had anticipated federal tactics and prepared countermeasures. The building contained sniper positions, escape routes, and communication equipment that allowed his associates to coordinate attacks from multiple directions. The gun battle lasted 47 minutes and involved over 30 criminals armed with military-grade weapons purchased from corrupt army supply officers. Romano's team was outnumbered but better trained, using federal tactical methods that had been developed specifically for urban warfare against organized crime. During the firefight, Romano captured documents that revealed the true scope of Vincent's operations. His identity theft network served as infrastructure for criminal enterprises, spanning from New York to California, providing false documentation for bootleggers, racketeers, murderers, and corrupt officials who needed clean backgrounds for legitimate business ventures. The network served America's criminal elite, but Vincent escaped during the confusion of the warehouse battle, using tunnels that connected to Chicago's extensive underground infrastructure. Romano's team found evidence that he'd been planning his escape route for months, establishing safe houses and transportation resources that would allow him to continue operations even under intensive federal pursuit. The documents recovered from the warehouse revealed Vincent's next target, Romano herself. He'd contracted with Chicago's most professional killers to eliminate the federal agent who threatened his network, offering a payment of $10,000 for her death and bonus payments for killing her entire investigative team. What would you do if you discovered that the criminal you were hunting had turned the entire investigation into a trap designed to eliminate you and everyone working with you? How many resources would you commit to capturing one man when that man had demonstrated the ability to corrupt or kill anyone who opposed him? Agent Romano was about to learn that Vincent Torino's Chicago network was just one branch of a criminal conspiracy that extended into the highest levels of American business and government, and his willingness to kill federal agents represented a declaration of war against law enforcement that would require unprecedented federal response to resolve. Vincent Torino sat in the back office of Maloney's Speakeasy on North Clark Street at 11:53 p.m. on May 24, 1927, signing death warrants disguised as business contracts, while Agent Romano's federal task force surrounded the building with enough firepower to level half the block. The air inside reeked of illegal gin, cigar smoke, and the metallic scent of fear as Chicago's criminal elite realized that their carefully purchased protection had finally failed them. When federal law enforcement commits unlimited resources to capturing one criminal, that criminal discovers whether their network can withstand the full weight of American justice or collapse under pressure that money and corruption cannot deflect. The final confrontation had been inevitable, since Romano's warehouse raid revealed the scope of Vincent's operations. Federal Director Hoover had authorized unprecedented resources for the investigation, 50 agents, military equipment, and coordination with Treasury Department officials who specialized in financial crimes that crossed state boundaries. Vincent's last gambit involved attempting to eliminate Romano and her team, using resources provided by Al Capone's organization. But federal surveillance had penetrated Chicago's criminal networks deeper than Vincent realized, and his meeting with Capone lieutenants had been monitored by bureau agents who'd spent months building cases against organized crime figures. Federal Strike Force Report, May 24, 1927, 11:47 p.m. Subject: Vincent Torino cornered in Speakeasy with 12 known associates. Building surrounded. Surrender demand issued. No response received. The siege lasted until dawn, ending when Vincent attempted to escape through basement tunnels that federal agents had already mapped and secured. His capture alive was considered essential. Too many questions remained about his network's connections to organized crime figures, corrupt officials, and the hundreds of false identities he'd created for criminals across America. Under federal interrogation, Vincent revealed details that shocked even experienced bureau investigators. His network had provided documentation for over 800 criminals in 3 years of operation. The customer list included bank robbers, murderers, bootleggers, and corrupt politicians who'd use false identities to hide assets, avoid prosecution, and continue criminal activities under official protection. The investigation had uncovered America's shadow economy. Romano's final report documented corruption that reached into Congress, federal courts, and state governments across the Midwest. Vincent's operation had thrived because it served criminals who possessed enough money and political influence to purchase protection from the very officials sworn to stop them. The case resulted in 47 federal indictments, including charges against 2 sitting congressmen, 1 federal judge, and dozens of state and local officials who'd accepted bribes in exchange for ignoring Vincent's activities. The network had generated over $2 million in revenue, most of which had been used to purchase additional protection and expand operations. But Vincent's most disturbing confession revealed the human cost of his operation. He admitted to personally killing or ordering the deaths of 18 people who'd threatened to expose his network, not just law enforcement officers like Frank Morrison and William Hayes, but customers who demanded refunds, associates who'd become liabilities, and innocent bystanders who'd asked inconvenient questions. Justice came with a final price. Vincent Torino was executed at Sing Sing Prison on March 15, 1929, after exhausting all appeals and federal clemency procedures. His last words reportedly expressed no remorse for the murders he'd committed, only regret that he'd been caught, before expanding his operations to serve international criminals seeking to enter America under false identities. Agent Romano remained with the Bureau of Investigation for 32 more years, specializing in organized crime cases that involved interstate coordination and federal jurisdiction. Her Vincent Torino investigation became a model for federal operations against sophisticated criminal networks that exploited gaps between local and national law enforcement. The Detroit warehouse that served as Vincent's headquarters was demolished in 1931, but construction workers reported finding additional basement rooms that contained remains of at least 6 people who'd never been officially connected to Vincent's network. The bodies were never identified, and the discovery was classified to avoid interfering with ongoing federal investigations. How many criminals learned from Vincent's mistakes and developed more sophisticated methods for exploiting America's administrative weaknesses? How many identity theft networks operated successfully because they studied Vincent's methods while avoiding his fatal errors? But Vincent Torino's legacy extended far beyond the criminals who studied his techniques, and even today, federal investigators occasionally discover false identities created using methods pioneered in his Detroit warehouse documentation, so sophisticated that the people using them may not realize their identities were purchased from a dead man's enterprise. They say that in Detroit's oldest cemeteries, groundskeepers still find unmarked graves that contain empty coffins, and sometimes visitors report seeing well-dressed men placing flowers on graves of people who supposedly died decades ago, but whose bank accounts remain mysteriously active. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.